Today, the presentation focuses on I-4 Ultimate project. This project we finished about a couple of years ago, a little over a couple of years, but the data that was used was from few years before that. It's 2015. The other thing about this is the work was done in 2018, so whatever I'm talking about StreetLight Data dates back to 2018. Let's go into the presentation. This presentation is split into 4 parts. The first 2 talk about the project and what we were challenged in the project itself. And the next part talks about how we use big data, why we looked for it, and how it helped us in addressing some of the questions. And then the later parts will talk about some of the challenges transferring towards big data from the traditional Bluetooth and household travel surveys that we are so used to. So we'll take a look at some of the newer ones too at the end. The project, people who are from Florida or particularly Orlando are very familiar with it, as most of us are living through the construction period for the last 5 years. The I-4 Ultimate section is the red portion on the map that is about 22 miles, and it bypasses over 20 interchanges. And then the setting is, it's Orlando metro region, which has about 750,000 households in 2015. And then they make about 10 million trips. The other aspect to consider is a lot of visitor attractions in the southern terminal of this project, home to some of the largest international destinations. So we have a lot of tourism that we need to model. On top of it, this is a corridor that has close weekend demand to weekday. They are almost similar. Weekend is about 95% of the demand of weekdays. So it's important for us to model weekend as well. So we have to model visitor, weekend, and then on top of it, this is an express lanes project, which means the tolls are set using congestion pricing strategy. They change every 15 minutes. The toll pricing changes every 15 minutes, and there are 9 segments on it. So it's important for us to know the interchange to interchange movement. On top of it, this project interacts with other systems like Florida Turnpike in green, and also other CFX facilities, which are also toll roads. Both are static toll roads, and the project being dynamic toll roads. This also led us to some challenges. First of all, this project is under construction for 5 years. Whatever we are trying to do is pre-construction. So the first challenge is, where would we get the data? If we have to do it today with Bluetooth or traditional sources, we'll be collecting today, which is not too bad. But the question is, because of construction, did anybody leave the corridor? That was one of the very early questions that we were asked. So how do we answer that? The second one is, okay, not only that we need the data from pre-construction of 5 years ago, but we also need this OD to OD movement. So if an express lanes, one of its segments spans over a couple of interchanges or bypasses a couple of interchanges, we need to estimate what would be the eligible demand, thereby who could be bought into that express lanes. So these are some of the questions that we were asked when we were dealing with this congestion pricing and then the forecast for the project. On top of it, as I mentioned earlier, we were supposed to model the visitor and weekend demand, given that this is so close to the attractions on the southern terminal. Overall, at the end of the day, we needed a DTA assignment, and not just for the corridor, but also for the sub-area that captures within the Beltway region. So if you are looking at a large region and trying to do a DTA assignment, then we need 15-minute trip tables. How would we get that? Normally, we would simply take the corridor profile, like the count profile along the corridor, split the trip tables if it is just a corridor model. But we are trying to do a sub-area model to capture the competition between the express lanes and the GP lanes, and as well as the competing alternatives to existing Beltway, which are static tolls. So there are a lot of competition in their choice assignment, route choice assignment. How did we look at StreetLight data? So, well, the very first one is, okay, we wanted to look at StreetLight data, but before that, first of all, let's see how many samples are even available back from 2015, pre-construction. So we asked StreetLight Data if they could provide us the samples for every single month for which they had data. Again, this is back in 2018. The study was done in 2018. At the time, they had data going from April 2014 all the way to December of 2017. So we pulled average daily samples by month for each of those months, trying to understand if there are enough samples. And since our project began late 2015, we looked at early 2015s like March, May, and June as our best months to look at the data. And then we compared that analysis across different years to address this very question. Did anybody leave the corridor? So this is our corridor starting from Sand Lake all the way going up to Williamson in the north. The first question is how many people are going from end to end? In this case, we show that as, okay, if 100% of the traffic starts somewhere at Sand Lake, there is about 11% on the other end. That's end-to-end movement. That's in 2015. The question is, how did that change by the time we got to 2016? So again, we plotted those distributions out and we said like, yeah, we did see a little bit, but not a whole lot of people leaving the corridors. And we did this analysis not just at a daily level, but also by different time periods, AM and PM peaks, primarily focusing on the commuter traffic, how it shifted. Now, we could not do this without big data in general, because this is all the things that happened in the past. We're trying to understand what were the movements, how they changed. So these are some things that we have studied. On top of it, this also allowed us to study weekend travel. Interestingly, weekend travel has a higher distribution, end-to-end distribution, just because, again, because of the attractions. So this type of analysis allowed us to study different aspects of the ODs. On top of it, we studied interchange to interchange, like how many people are going towards turnpike systems, and how did that change over the course of time? Was that impacted by construction? So it helped us answer those questions. Then that's good to know about the corridor. But for modeling, especially modeling subareas, we need the distribution, which is basically to compare what our model is telling us. Our models are based on either gravity model or destination choice models. And so oftentimes we look at triplet distribution, and then we also look at very aggregate district to district flows. Now, when we look at aggregate district to district flows, all of this region could be one district in a regional model. That doesn't tell us enough information. So what we did is we defined about 54 districts by grouping 1,100 TAZs. And then that also gave us 50 externals just because we extracted the subarea. And StreetLight, by definition at that point, didn't give us trips, but what they gave is basically index. And so we asked for samples. We want like OD samples. And again, this is a time where we were transitioning from household travel survey, Bluetooth surveys into this big data. So we know how to work with samples. We know what our control totals are, and we know how to expand it. But with index and other metrics volumes, we really have to understand before applying them. So we took the samples and we used model trip ends as our control totals, and then expanded back to it. So that's how you see that model trip 7.3 million matching closely to StreetLight. But what we are interested in is not really the absolute number, but rather the distribution of the trips. How many are external to external? What is StreetLight data telling us? What is our model telling us? So we grouped all of them into this 54 by 54 and started analyzing the data. And then furthermore, we also did something like how many people could use I-4 corridor, and then that project section, which is I-4 ultimate section. So we were able to answer some of those questions and then compare against model. The other one is, well, StreetLight data picked up only 2%. Earlier, I was showing only 2%. But that 2% is really the long distance portion where our model is not picking up that. So model average trip length, if you look at to the right, where model is getting only 21 miles as the average trip length for this region, where StreetLight Data picks up about 36 or close to 37 miles. So that's a big difference. So we are having more EE traffic in the model, but not to the right locations. So we revalidated the model to reflect that. On top of it, the model, so we further, what we did is we just zoomed into the project area and then further aggregated those 54 districts into 10 districts and started looking at it. StreetLight Data sends most of the trips south along the project. That's where we have 23%, but model is reporting only 11%. And model is instead sending the east-west movement. So this alone could make or break the project if it didn't correct for these distributions. Now, this is all happening at the trip table level. On top of it, StreetLight Data picked up some nice, interesting aspects of it, which this District 44, which is close to I Drive, Sand Lake, um, where we have a lot of night activity, which is not reflected in any of our models. Our models are not exclusively designed for that type of nighttime visitor attractions, which is another thing to pay attention since we are at that project terminal end. So that's another thing that we have to pay attention to. And finally, DTA. For DTA, we are not just looking at the corridor, but we are looking at this entire sub area, which has about 1,100 zones and 54 districts. So if we pick up an origin district way up in the north, going to 3 different destinations. So 1 origin, 3 destinations. Each destination has a different temporal distribution. Going to Disney happens like during the Disney business hours. The distribution is pretty much flat throughout the business hours, and then it drops down. Going to downtown is what we expect, the commuter traffic going into the city for work, and then it slightly goes down throughout the day. And then for the airport, same thing, earlier than the peak hours, like their peaking is slightly earlier than the regular peak hours, which is again different. So this is really extremely important for us to slice the daily or time period trip table into each individual hour and further down to 15 minutes. So that's another use. And in order to do that, not every OD will have continuous data for every hour. So the map to the left shows the data. Each row is 1 OD, and the x-axis is number of hours. So each box is every hour. So if you have a green or red throughout the day, which means we have continuous samples. As we can see, not every OD will have continuous data, but we also don't need every single hour to split the trip table. We can assume that we are modeling between 6 to 10 p.m. in the night, and that's good enough. And the rest of that, we can just use a generalized profile, as that is really not going to improve or deviate the project forecast generally, but in some cases that may not be the case. So we looked at continuous 15-hour data where we got like 60% of the ODs fall in that range. And then this 60% of ODs carry about 95% of the trips. Finally, what did we face and what are the errors that we're seeing in the model? The map shows, the orange-green map shows penetration rate. This is again from StreetLight Data website a couple of years ago, where we have usually, when we ask about the sample size, usually we have underestimation of the samples. In this particular case, we have the reverse of it. We have too many samples in some places where that needs to be normalized. For instance, this region is down Disney World, and some of them are also along the corridors of 417 and I-95 corridors, which we don't expect to have more traffic than downtown or airport, or some handful of locations where we know there will be more activities. But in this particular case, there were more samples. So So we reweighted those samples again based on the model trip ends because we believe the model trip ends are sort of more accurate because they are based on, again, the trip generation rates. We don't necessarily believe in the distribution, but at least the trip generations, we have somewhat more confidence rather than just taking the big data at its face value. And also at the time of study, there were some questions on, okay, what do we know of the users? Now we are moving from household travel surveys into this new big data, where there are several questions asked, like, what do we know of the demographics? How do we know we have more um, homogeneous distribution across different age cohorts? So we pulled up some of the statistics at the time from different research institutions and saw that the age group that uses cell phone primarily, like there is a huge distortion in that, like 96% of age groups 18 to 29 use smartphones, um, whereas only 53% of the senior population is using smartphones. So how do we address those issues? Those are some of the questions that we had at the time. Um, in the recent one, StreetLight Data, this is from the StreetLight Data website, where now they put up this, like they are addressing some of these biases that their device sample coverage by census tract, and also they put together this, okay, the average age, we like to see median age, but it's close enough, I guess, in this case. How they are closely matching to census. And so these metrics kind of reassures like it's somewhat close to um, the expectations that we would like to see, although I'm not 100% sure how to extract these type of variables from passively collected data. That's maybe it's written somewhere in the white paper. But nevertheless, to say like these are some of the biases that we worried back in 2018 when we were pulling the data, and some of them over the past 2 years have been improved, to say. The other type of bias that we faced is, okay, we are getting every single hour, but how does those samples compare to traffic counts? In our sub-area, we had about 2,000, approximately 2,000 count locations collected from different ways, telemeter locations, portables, host counts. So we threw in all the data to build a temporal profile of that sub-area region, where you see the blue line, it kind of goes with our classic traffic volume, where you have a classic AM peak and the PM peak and the midday is low. But we didn't see the same distribution with StreetLight samples. We plotted StreetLight GPS samples from 2015, 2017, and also LBS data from 2017. All tell the same trend. There is a uptick in midday samples. This kind of surprised us a little bit, but not totally, as we can basically say that there is more cell phone activity or smartphone usage in those hours, maybe during lunch hours, people are running errands and things like that. So we have to rescale all of those samples or reweight them so that they don't overemphasize that we have more midday traffic. So these are some of the things that we have to reweight it after taking the data. What's our overall experience on this? We use StreetLight data to answer the 6 questions, like what are the historical flows, what is the ramp to ramp, entry exits, spatial temporal validation of the model, spatially the district to district, temporally, and like slicing it for trip table, encourage eligible trips, how many people are gonna likely use the trips or use the corridor, and then eventually to develop a weekend model, which is different from a weekday model, and the distributions are completely different. And then finally, this is some of our newer work. This is basically trips versus tours. This is to overcome some of the biases. What we recently did is we got the tour data. By definition, StreetLight, the stop definition of StreetLight is if a vehicle did not move 5 meters in 5 minutes, then it's traditionally a stop. So what we would get is this as a trip. Now that is good if we are looking at small areas like the one that I showed. But our recent work involved in a new statewide model development and validation. And a big portion of that is a long distance component. So for us, that OD needs to be going from all the way from Pensacola into Miami. That's one tour with several stops in between. So we needed this type of information to understand where is our OD. So this is not necessarily an issue if you're working with a smaller geography, but with the larger geographies, one thing to pay attention to is as the scale of this increases, we just need to make sure the trip doesn't end somewhere on the interstate in a rest area or a service plaza and we lose that trip. Even with more samples, like 1 year worth of samples or a couple of years with 100 billion samples, we still have the same phenomenon. In this, what we noticed is the long distance to, or the tours versus trips is about half. We lose about half of them if we don't pay proper attention to the stops. And then we also needed like the travelage information. So some of the data we got is like how many of them are Florida residents and out-of-state residents, and also where their location is. No, this is the traveler information is pretty much a guesswork, like how long the device has been in that location in that 1 year, and that is most likely the home location. That's also an educated guess, but it is not the same as our traditional household travel surveys where we send that to the address and the person says, I'm so-and-so, I'm the owner of this house living here, and this is my travel itineraries. So now we are trying to infer their demographics based on the patterns that we see, which is the inverse of the traditional household travel survey. But nevertheless, there's still big data without which we could not get. And the data in this particular project that we used is about 1 billion rows of data. That's, I would like to say it's about 400,000 tours and about 1 billion trips that was collected throughout 2018 using location-based services.